right?
Yes, we do.
We do.
Okay, well, thanks. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. Normally, I'm actually really happy to be interrupted by questions. It's just a little bit hard over Zoom. So I'm happy to take questions afterwards, because if you ask them while I'm talking, I probably won't see it. But I am happy to take questions. So as mentioned in my bio there, I was really trained as an evolutionary ecologist, but over the last 10 to 15 years, we've been in Reno since 2008. I've shifted to thinking about butterflies and other insects responding to climate change and pesticides and other things. And it's been an interesting last couple of years to think about butterflies and climate change and pesticides, et cetera, largely because of this paper. Sorry if the text is small there. I'm sure many of you know this. This was the Hallman et al. Report from Germany in the fall of 2017, where they reported an 82% decline in the biomass of flying insects over a few decades. It was some pretty shocking numbers. I mean, it wasn't the first time that all of us had thought about insect conservation and declining insects. I'm sure you all have for a long time. I think this paper caught people's attention because it was about biomass, which is kind of like not what most of us entomologists think about, right? We really think about population density or species diversity or, you know, community diversity, et cetera. But these folks literally just talked about the mass of insects going down, which caught everybody's attention, led to some pretty extreme press coverage. That phrase, the insect apocalypse, caught on. Other studies came out over the next few years. So this is like 2017, 18, 19, 20. A consensus kind of emerged that many insects in many parts of the world were declining on the order of like 1 to 2% per year, which is pretty bad, right? Because that's a compounding loss. You wouldn't like it if your bank account was declining at that rate. So what does this have to do with our backyard, the Western US? Most of those reports that came out in those years from 2017 to 2020, 2021 were from much more densely populated areas. You know, Germany is not the Western US that has tons of open spaces. So I'm going to tell you what I think the status is of butterflies in our region. So that's where I'll get to. Let me give you 3 questions that are kind of going to structure what I talk about. First, what are the drivers of Anthropocene extirpation and extinction? I mean, in general, we all know that biodiversity is suffering. I don't know if people saw, it was just yesterday or the day before, another report came out that said the mass of mammals on the planet, only 10% of the mass of mammals is wild mammals. The rest of it is basically us, right? So decline is kind of everywhere, and we'd like to understand the relative contributions of habitat destruction and climate change, et cetera. So that's one big question for us. We'd also like to know, how are the odds set? And I mean sort of like which traits of species predispose them to extinction or not, and do those rules, if you will, change? I'm from Nevada now, so we like to make gambling metaphors. And then last, how can we minimize losses? Which is really a basic question, but it's a basic question that's increasingly hard for anybody to ignore. Okay, so what are the major drivers? I get sometimes frustrated with my colleagues talking to the press, and I mean sort of at my academic colleagues talking to the press over the last couple of years, where reporters will call and say, what's the deal with insects? Why are they declining? And there's a tendency for scientists, that I'm sure you all know, to talk about the unknowns and how many things we don't understand. But the fact is, we fundamentally know it's habitat loss, degradation, and climate change. I mean, we know those are the big 3. It's not to say we understand all the details. There's some agreement that habitat loss historically is the biggest factor, you know, leading up till now. Habitat degradation is really complicated because it can involve interactions between invasive species and pesticides. I'll mention some of that. And then there's climate change, which has been the trickiest one to parse out, especially with respect to insects, because a lot of the big data sets that have been analyzed in recent years come from parts of the world like Germany or Western Europe, where habitat destruction and climate change are just inexorably linked. You can't really separate them. Western US, we've had a chance to look at butterfly data sets where we can sort of look at enough places where butterflies are persisting in relatively pristine areas and compare them to not. And so that's one thing that my research group has contributed to the conversation, is understanding climate change effects. But my sort of engagement in these questions actually comes from the Central Valley. So I grew up in the Central Valley near Sacramento, then went to UC Davis for my PhD. As mentioned, I was doing evolutionary questions, but I was working in a lab where Dr. Art Shapiro, who some of you may know, he's a great butterfly guy of Northern California, had been working on this long-term monitoring program for what was then 30 plus years. It's now 50 plus years. And right around the time I joined the lab, which was 2000, the year 2000, he had just been reporting these really shocking declines from the Central Valley in terms of the number of butterflies seen every year. So let me show you what the Shapiro data set looks like. So there's a elevational profile of Northern California, Coast Range, Central Valley, Sierra Nevada. There's sites there, 10 sites, the colored dots. The years next to each dot are the year that Art began continuous sampling, which is to say every other week, these locations have been visited when it isn't the middle of winter without fail. So it's a ridiculous and remarkable data set. As far as I know, there is no other data set like this in the world. The British butterfly monitoring scheme is almost as old, but it's pretty different, and then it's very dispersed. It has more geography in it, but it has a lot of people involved. It's just a different program. This is slightly longer. It's temporally very intense. From my lab, we've taken over the monitoring of the 5 high elevation sites, and Art remarkably continues to do the 5 low elevation sites. 50, now it's 51 or so years later that he started this. It's an amazing thing. Anyways, so when I started in his lab in the 2000s, this is what had been going on. I know there's a lot going on there. You don't have to squint too hard. Basically, it's a sample of species not doing well at the Central Valley sites, and none of these sites had themselves been destroyed. Art had remarkable foresight in picking study sites that have remained intact, but of course the Central Valley itself has changed. In any event, for the three panels there, for example, in the upper left there, that large marble Euchloeausonides that'll actually come back. You can see 3 sites there where what's being graphed over time is the probability of observing that animal on any one day, and you see plummeting, right? So things are going down. These are a lot of species that are suffering. Because you're entomologists, you're probably glancing at this and you don't just see butterflies, but you see some diversity in life history there. There's some skippers there, there's some swallowtails, there's the monarch, large, migratory species. There's a lot of different biology encompassed in these declines, which ends up being a pretty interesting riddle that we're still working on. Like, who is suffering more than others? It's tricky. Here's another picture of this change over time. So here you see there's a 4th site added here, but this is the heart of the Central Valley. That's observed number of species over time. Obviously, it's not up to the present there, but that's going through about 2010. And what you see there is that dramatic downturn in the mid-1990s. This was really the original puzzle that drew me to this data. Why? What happened in the mid-1990s? Well, let's look at the area. So here's a picture of the 3 counties, Solano, Yolo, and Sacramento. And if you drive the I-80 corridor from the Bay Area up into the mountains, you pass through these study sites. That's a lot of ag. So all the green there is agricultural land. The pink is developed urban. It's basically pavement. No good for butterflies. Agricultural land, of course, can be good for butterflies, and lots of those agricultural margins through much of the 20th century were really productive. I mean, I grew up playing in some weed lots and agricultural margins that had lots of butterflies in them in the mid-20th century, but agricultural land in the Central Valley is being lost to pavement. So the first thing we looked at was the rate at which open lands of any kind, ag or natural spaces, there's not many, the rate at which those lands have been put under pavement. Here you see some of those graphs. The details in terms of the y-axis don't matter much, but it's basically the fraction of land in each county that has been put under the pavement. No longer good to butterflies. What you see is it's a really steady increase. So that's not good, but it also doesn't help us understand the mid-1990s downturn. What changed in the mid-1990s? Brand new class of super powerful pesticides hit the Central Valley like a bomb, which is neonicotinoids, which I'm sure many of you know about. These nicotine imitators that are neurotoxins for insects go systemic in plants. The graph that you're seeing there is on a log scale. The three colored lines are the kilograms of neonicotinoids in those three counties. So if it wasn't on a log scale, it would be on a terrifying, exponentially increasing curve. And the gray lines in the background are traditional classes. Here you see neonicotinoids versus butterfly richness. That's not terribly profound. It's a negative relationship. Years with more neonics had fewer butterflies, but of course, there is a correlation issue here in that I told you butterflies were going down and neonics were going up, but we have done a lot of statistical modeling of this. Basically, you can remove the overall negative trend and look at all of the sort of micro ups and downs over the years of the butterflies and neonics. And if you look at how often do the butterflies have a down year in a year when the neonic rates went slightly up. Doing that, we got a result that was fairly stunning. So I know this is a boring looking table, but the key bit there is that we estimated the effect of neonicotinoids and the effect of converted land on butterfly richness over time. Those are negative numbers there. And the remarkable thing is that they're of a similar magnitude. So basically it's, while controlling for the fact that they're going, one's going up and one's going down, we remove that. And then you're just looking at those little ups and downs. The ups and downs of neonics have a similar magnitude negative association with butterflies as does converted land. We also saw a hint that smaller bodied butterflies had a more negative relationship with neonics. I won't pretend that's the most impressive looking relationship in that graph there, but it's a hint. And it gets back to this puzzle of like, who's suffering more than others that we'll come back to. We also saw a hint that species with fewer generations per year are suffering more. Okay, so the Central Valley, right? It's a big, complicated place. If it's the case that neonicotinoids, probably other pesticides too, are having a dramatic negative impact on the butterflies persisting in all of those green bits in there, then that raises the obvious hypothesis of exposure and drift and accumulation, and neonicotinoids in particular can drift through waterways, become systemic in plants. I have no training in toxicology, but in the last few years, I found myself trying to learn because I've been kind of shocked to turn to the literature and find how rarely ecotoxicologists have gone to landscapes like that and simply asked how many poisons are accumulating in the plants that are resources for insects. I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to work with the Xerces Society to do this with milkweeds. Milkweeds, of course, we care about because of the monarch butterfly. So we went to all those sites there that you see in that map on the left there. There are sites of different sort of land properties, agricultural sites, urban sites, wildlife refuges. The map is complicated because what you see in the background, the darker red, is the diversity of pesticides. It's a very complicated landscape. In any event, we drove around and just sort of grabbed milkweeds in places and times of the year when we know they will be used by monarch butterflies. And what we found is pretty gnarly. So this is some of the gloom and doom here. And I think I didn't actually say, but I will say now, I do get to a bit of a positive place at the end of this talk, but there is some gnarly stuff along the way. This is not an easy graph to read. Apologize, it's super busy. The gestalt here, though, is that the rows are compounds, so pesticides found in leaves, and the columns are individual locations, and each location was represented by some handfuls of plants. Basically, every single plant had some pesticide in it, and sometimes the levels were really kind of surprising. Here, let me zoom in on the insecticides because we found different classes of compounds. This is just insecticides. The white dots there are locations where compounds were found above a known LD50 threshold for monarch caterpillars. So that's a toxicological measure, the concentration that would kill 50% of the population. It may not look like there's a lot of dots on there, but the vast majority of these compounds have never been tested against monarch caterpillars or any other non-target pest lep species. So this is just of a few of these where people have looked. There's some very toxic leaves out there on the landscape in places where we know that monarchs would be laying eggs. The black dots are compounds in locations found in trace amounts, so very low. Doesn't necessarily mean they're not important. Come back to that. So there were neonicotinoids in here, There were plenty of them. Clethianidin is particularly important, but they perhaps weren't the major player. I had hypothesized that neonics might be very, very important in the Central Valley. It's a complicated soup out there. This particular compound there, chlorantraniliprole, that's the hardest thing I did today was saying that, known to be quite toxic to monarch caterpillars, found in 58 out of 227 leaves that we look at. That's a lot of toxic plants out there, which kind of informs that discussion that I don't know if this group has had of, are milkweeds limiting for monarch butterflies? I've had this conversation where people will say, we want to go plant milkweeds because we need to help the monarch. And then some people, sometimes entomologists will say, milkweeds aren't limiting. I know all these milkweed stands that are still out there. Well, in the Central Valley, which is a pretty important breeding location for monarchs, if every single leaf is loaded with toxins, milkweeds kind of are limiting if you mean non-toxic milkweeds or non-poisonous. I mean, non-toxic, from the anthropogenic compound perspective. So there's some very high level things, and then there's just this general possibility for synergy, an average of 20 compounds per leaf in agricultural areas. We know pretty much this close to nothing about how synergistic effects among these compounds affect non-target pests. All of those trace compounds could be acting in a more detrimental way than one compound above a high level. We simply don't know because it's quite hard to study. In refuges, similarly, 14 compounds per leaf on average. And Xerces Society did some great detective work here, sort of going back to these locations and asking refuge managers, what's the deal? Are you spraying these things in refuges? Usually it was as simple as, here's a wildlife refuge. It's important, in this case for the monarch, because there's a lot of milkweed there, but there might be a rice field just up the road that had just, used an application of something the week before. So it had washed down the way, filled up these plants with these toxins. Also in retail plants, so the focus of this study was actually on the wild milkweeds, but we threw in a handful from just 2 stores. They were big box stores, just went in, grabbed some milkweeds, threw them in there just to see. They had quite a few pesticides in them as well. And so we left this study thinking, well, this is pretty important, right? Because people care about monarch butterflies. They want to go to Home Depot or wherever, a nice local nursery, and buy some milkweeds. Are they buying toxic plants for their caterpillars? So this is another study in collaboration with the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society had employees at all of these cities go into nurseries. It was a lot of big box stores, but a lot of smaller ones, and sometimes very small sort of boutique local nurseries, and just buy the milkweeds they had. So we ended up with 235 milkweed plants from across the migratory range of the butterfly. And again, pretty depressing. Similar picture here. It's inverted now. So now the rows are locations, the columns are compounds. You can see California is a big block there. Visited many stores in California. 61 different pesticides. 38% of samples contained at least one pesticide above a sublethal threshold. So that was an interesting difference here. Looking out on the landscape, it was very easy to find leaves that were above a lethal threshold. Here, sublethal thresholds were more common. Don't exactly understand why, except to say it's a different mix of poisons that are in these plants. And sublethal here means compounds that are known to interfere with development somehow, sort of taking longer to get to pupation, or adults with smaller wings, etc. Again, keeping in mind that the vast, vast majority of these pesticides have not been tested on monarch caterpillars or any other non-target lab. So then, having the data, the next question we asked is, well, can we recommend that folks should at least avoid the big box stores, right? It would be a nice message if we could say your local nurseries are in good shape, because maybe they're using less pesticides. So here you're going to see a graph where the x-axis there is store size, essentially no effect. So the right side of that graph is chains that have more than 100 stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, etc. And then the left are very local boutique things. That's the percentage of plants that had some exceedance in terms of a sublethal pesticide in there with a negative impact on monarch caterpillar development. Fairly sort of surprising. It turns out that all of these outlets use a lot of pesticides to get their plants from seedling to the shelves. And we can't parse it easily by store size. Okay, well, what about those labels, right? We all know those labels: butterfly friendly, pollinator garden, et cetera, et cetera. It's phrased in various ways. It's phrased to make you think that it's like the organic label in the store, but I think we all know it's not that because it's not regulated. There are people that are trying to come up with regulated versions of this, but if you see butterfly friendly, it's not regulated. And here's a shocker, and this is the low point of doom and gloom, so bear with me, I apologize for this. Things with that label were almost twice as likely to have a sublethal level of a pesticide that's bad for monarch caterpillars, and we do not know why. It is a robust pattern across the country. There's something different about those plants that are sort of being set aside for that shelf that they're going to try to sell to you as pollinator friendly, and it is almost twice as worse for monarch caterpillars. I'm sorry, every time I say that, I feel bad because we all love to garden. The message is still putting plants in your yard is good. We're trying to set up follow-up studies now so we can figure out what the heck to do. It is possible that some of those compounds will fade over time. We did follow a subset of plants for a couple of weeks, and some of them faded, some of them don't. The neonicotinoids don't fade. It's also possible that getting the plants out of the dirt that they come in from Home Depot could be good. It's also possible that a couple of days of heavy watering could be good. We don't know. We do think it's worth, when you buy plants, asking, especially if it's, your local place, just, hey, what's the pipeline like that got this plant to this stage? Because we need to learn more about this. It's pretty bad. Okay, let me move on. Let's leave the Central Valley, which is full of depressing things. Let's go to the Sierra Nevada. Around 2010, we kind of thought we had this picture of Northern California figured out, where declines were very severe at the low elevations. The mountains seemed pretty stable. So I thought we had a sort of a nice study system moving forward. We got all of the sort of anthropogenic effects at low elevations, and then we got pristine things in the mountains, and then this action happened. So the mega drought of 2011 to 2015-ish, as you all know, because you live in the West, right? We get the worst drought in 1,000 years. And whether it's 1,000 years or 1,200 years, it doesn't really matter. Really hot, really dry. Okay, well, that has a pretty amazing effect on the mountains. And it's worth pausing here to say, I think it's fair to say that ecologists were wrong about the role of mountains and climate change. It was a pretty strong expectation around the turn of the century, around 2000, that topographic complexity, mountains, would provide all kinds of refugia for insects. If it gets too hot, they shift upslope a little bit, they can go to a north-facing slope, whatever, they're going to find places. That might be true with gradual climate change. I don't think it's true with these mega events that are particularly nasty in the West. Here's a couple of complicated slides, but that have these really important messages for low versus high elevation. So the low elevation is in the bottom panel there. High elevation is the top. Each dot is sort of an index of how well the butterflies did at that location in a year. Higher values are a good year, lower values are a bad year. It's averaged over 160 species of butterflies. A couple of interesting lessons here. This is the decline in the Central Valley that I showed you in the mid-90s. So we already knew about that. We think we know something about that. And then after that mid-90s decline, the Central Valley had kind of stabilized. But check out that. There was an interesting upswing in the Central Valley in the mega drought years. Pin that in your head as a mystery that I'll come back to because it's pretty interesting. But right now I want to talk about the mountains. The more recent declines in the mountains that really are complicated. The drought years were really bad for the butterflies in the mountains. It was noticeable. We're out there. It was like there are fewer butterflies around immediately after those drought years started. You can see that downward trend. Looking backwards, we see that it perhaps had started before the mega drought years. And I'll get to why we think that is. But in terms of the relative impact of sort of anthropogenic stressors, the thing to notice here is that both the mountains and the valley have reached more than half a standard deviation away from their historical baseline, which suggests that the impacts of climate change acting in the mountains on relatively pristine locations can be almost as bad as the accumulative effects of pesticides and habitat destruction and climate change on the valley. And you might pause and think to yourself, that literally doesn't make sense because you added up three things there and one thing up here. I think there's an important difference between the mountains and the valley, which is where I'll get back to at the very end when I answer that question of why the valley had a briefly good years during the drought years. But so what's the deal? How is climate affecting the montane butterflies? This has been a lot of the statistical work we've done in recent years. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details. That graph there shows you the relationship between minimum temperatures And butterflies over time across elevations, minimum temperatures, nighttime warming has a bigger negative effect on butterflies at high elevations. And here's a climatological thing that is apparently well known among climatologists, of which I'm obviously not one. Nighttime temperatures are warming more rapidly at high elevations globally, which is to say the difference between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures is compressing at higher elevations. Here you see a rather sobering picture for how nighttime temperatures have changed over time at our 10 study sites. So the hotter colors there, the oranges and the reds, are the low elevation sites. You see some warm years, some cool years, back up again. The other colors there, the teals and blues and greens, are the nighttime temperatures at the mountain sites. Those things have been rocketing up inexorably, I believe, having sort of multifarious negative consequences for insects there, which we simply didn't notice till the drought years, because during the drought years, those warming nighttime temperatures, basically, the precipitation problem caught up to them, and you had warming nights with very dry years, and then we had some very bad years for the butterflies in the mountains. In contrast, there's maximum temperatures, which you see sort of move up and down in concert across elevations, and there's precipitation. There were some wet years there in the 90s, El Nino action, and then very recent dry and hot years. But it seems to be that place in the middle there that's really gnarly. So something we're working on now is how is that happening? Because you can, as entomologists, you can imagine warming temperatures having a negative effect on butterflies. Could be direct physiological stress. It could be that it's messing with overwintering stages and other things, or it could be plant stress. My gut feeling walking around in the mountains in those years was plant stress. There you see a picture of one of our big meadows at Castle Peak in 2012, the height of the drought, and immediately after. You can visibly see it's the same time of year, the browning on the left there. This is work we have in progress. We're using satellite data historically to try and parse out the effect of plants. I think I'm going to end up being wrong. It seemed to me that it was going to be plant effects, but the signal we're pulling out of the historical data is that it seems to be you can account for the plant effect, but you're getting these physiological effects in terms of that are timed well for overwintering stages. In other words, you can account for productivity in the summer, but then if it's really warm in the middle of winter, that seems to be really bad for insects the next season. That's stuff that we have in progress. So this has all been about this narrow slice of Northern California. You're not in Northern California, so let me zoom out and encompass the whole region. What's happening across the entire West here. For this, this was basically my pandemic project. When the pandemic started, we didn't stop doing field work, but other things slowed down, so we had the time to take on some new data projects. I was lucky enough to get in touch with Jeffrey Glassberg and get this data set. So this is North American Butterfly Association midsummer counts at all those locations. The color is elevation. Basically, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this program, but they get a bunch of butterfly enthusiasts once per year in the middle of summer to just go out and count all the butterflies in an area. It's challenging data because a once per year census is not ideal, but it's excellent in the sense that it has this broad geographic expanse. Using that data, we estimated, apologies for all the text there, but we estimated a 1.6% decline in the abundance of individual butterflies across those sites. I'm not showing you too much raw data there. I'll show you some in just a second. But basically, the way to think about that number is if you imagine going to a mountain meadow, and most of these locations were in pretty pristine areas. Imagine going to a mountain meadow 20 years ago and seeing 1,000 individual butterflies. Our analyses of these data predict that today you would go and see around 725 individual butterflies, which is a pretty shocking reduction. It's a lot of sites there. There's hundreds. It's not easy to visualize it. What I'm showing here, which I know is a little bit hard to look at, the big vertical graph there is all of those sites organized from the most declining at the top to the least declining. And then the bouncing around time series plots is just to show you sort of what the bounciness looks like in terms of total numbers of butterflies changing over time. Most locations look like those top three panels, which is subtle but significant declines over time. So fewer butterflies is kind of just the raw fact out of this data. What's the deal? So again, this is statistical work that we do in the winter when butterflies aren't flying. We take a lot, it's basically historical detective work. We take descriptions of climate from all those locations, descriptions of climate change, things about the land use properties, agricultural, urban things, and we try to predict which site is more or less declining based on all of that information. What we found is that climate change factors went right to the top of the list. It's a big messy table there, but you see fall maximum temperatures are at the top there with a negative association with butterflies. This was a complicated result because we also found a positive association with summer maximum temperatures. And this gets a bit in the weeds, but I think you all can appreciate it. So I think the positive effect of summer maximum temperatures is actually methodological, because if you go out to the exact same meadow you went last year, and it's a couple of degrees warmer on this day in July, all of your ectotherms are going to be a little more active, and so you count a few more of them. You control for that effect statistically, then we see a negative association with fall maximum temperatures, which I think now, given our recent results with satellite data and plants, seems to be largely about the physiology of either overwintering stages or possibly sort of stress on females at the very end of the season when they need to be gathering nectar and laying eggs. They may be drying out more than they would have 15 years ago, and it's leading to fewer butterflies the next year. Why talk about fall and summer as separate things? This is another climatological thing that was news to me in doing this work in the last few years, is that climate change is not homogeneous across seasons, especially in the West. Fall is warming faster than any other season, which is what's in that graph there. I mean, it's messy and there's tons of geographic variation, but fall is where we are feeling the most severe warming conditions, which I think in the arid West seems to be particularly bad for our butterflies, at least. Here's yet another way to see those results, and then I'm going to move on from NABA. The x-axis there is the difference between fall and summer warming in any one location. So farther to the right on the x-axis is a location where fall is warming faster than summer. And then on the y-axis there is butterflies are doing well or butterflies are doing poorly. So basically the lower right quadrant are places where fall is warming faster than summer and we're seeing fewer butterflies. And that is just raw numbers there. So that's not any sort of complicated statistics going on. The signal is messy there because it's raw. We're not accounting for other spatial things, but it's a pretty strong signal. And see, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Yeah, so climate. So everybody's seen pictures like this, right? Here's climate change across the whole country. The whole country here provides kind of an interesting test on everything I just told you, because if we look at climate change across the US, as I'm sure everybody knows, the West is cooking more rapidly than other parts of the country. The West and sort of a bit up into the upper Midwest. The hotter colors there are more rapid warming in recent decades. We also see similar signals for precipitation. So the salmon colors there are drying out. This is actually from an interesting paper. I put the title up there in case anybody's curious, where these authors were asking, are national park lands in the US being disproportionately impacted by climate change? And the answer is yes, because so many of our national park lands are in the West. In any event, if you look at that graph right there, if my claim that climate change is particularly bad for butterflies, or it's leading to declines, then you'd look at this graph and you'd say, okay, well, butterflies should be doing better in certain parts of the East, in particular the Southeast, right? I have not worked with data from that part of the country, but luckily these folks did. So these folks worked with that same NABA data, but encompassing the whole country. And the next graph and the next figure I'm going to show you is a sort of a heat map of the whole country that shows where butterflies are doing well and where they're doing poorly. And lo and behold, in the West, they found patterns very congruent with what we did, totally different analyses, by the way, with hotspots of declining butterflies really in your parts of the world in Southern California. Southeast, not so much. You're more likely to find stable or increasing butterfly populations in that part of the world where the temperatures have not been cooking as fast as the rest. Let me shift gears now, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk about as much about these last couple questions. I know I've been talking for 52 minutes, I think, which is a lot. I'm going to give you just a punchline here for these last two, and hopefully we have time for a couple questions. My next question was, how are the odds set? Which is to say, can we understand which butterflies are doing better or worse than others? I kind of want to give you with the message that we're working on this. It's tricky. Here's a phylogeny, thanks to Nick Grisham and company, this is a genome level phylogeny for all butterflies in the Western US. The darker colors there show butterflies that are more at risk. Risk is a whole other story here, but it's basically associated with declines. The yellow there are skippers, the blues are lycaenids. In the lower left there are nymphalids. There is a phylogenetic signal here in that we get a lot of clustered risk in lycaenids and skippers, also in pierrids. Nymphalids, not so much. But the challenge is within those groups, we're not doing a very good job finding traits that predispose species to decline. There is a signal that smaller bodied species in general are doing worse and species with fewer generations per year, but it's very little variance that we're explaining. And what we don't find as important are things that are kind of surprising, like ecological specialization. Number of host plants is not doing a very good job predicting decline. It's also the case that geographic range is not doing a very good job predicting decline. Okay, as promised, moving on quickly. So that was how are the odds set? We're working on it. What can we do? So things that we're trying to do, we're trying to raise awareness of things like pesticides in plants that we happily buy from the nursery and hope we're providing good butterfly food in our gardens. There's some issues there that we need to work on. We're also working to map habitat in the Central Valley that can be used for restoration. And this was, again, a nice collaboration with the Xerces Society, where basically Scott Black, the Xerces Society president, came to me and said, what if we thought about the little strips around agricultural areas, basically the ditches and the margins, as potentially restorable habitat for insects? Let's map those and ask how much of those, how much is there and where we might use it. It turns out that ag margins, if you take all those little black lines on the right there, which are the little strips around agricultural fields, those agricultural margins, if you add them all up, are 2.5 times the area of all natural area. Sorry, agricultural margins are 2.5 times the area of all natural lands in the Central Valley put together. So all like whatever beautiful little remnant grasslands you've gone to, riparian areas, it's nothing compared to all of those margins, which are crappy, admittedly, right? But there are farmers who are interested in allowing some plants to come back on those margins, investing in restoration. So I think there are opportunities there. But really the main thing we've been working on, and I'm going to leave you with just a couple pictures of individual butterflies here, is identifying new species for conservation attention. We all, of course, would know about monarchs in recent years. Monarchs in our rankings usually end up in the 20 to 30 worst butterflies in terms of overall trajectories. I mean, they're not in the top 20. We can always find 20 species in the West that are doing worse than the monarch. Here's the one that I always like to suggest as a new poster child for butterfly conservation in the West, Vanessa Annabella, the West Coast lady. You see a lot of time series plots there. It's basically a lot of downward trends, which is remarkable. This is not an animal that anyone 20 years ago would have put on the top of a list for a declining species, right? It has a huge range. It's basically all of the Western US. It has native hosts, it has exotic hosts. It seems pretty robust. It's a large dispersive animal in shocking decline. There are places in the mountains where we used to see it on 80% of the days that we'd go out. Now we see a couple of them a year, and my students and I are all excited. We're texting each other when we see one West Coast lady. Who thought we would have come to that, right? This animal, another fascinating one. So the common sooty wing, so-called common. When I was a kid in the Central Valley, this thing was so abundant in weed lots in Sacramento that the locals would call it a moth, right? As we all know happens to butterflies that are too common, they get called moths. But in any event, severe declines, extirpation in large parts of the Central Valley. Large marble is also a pretty interesting one, and the pearly marble. There's a pattern here too, and I know I'm talking a long time now, but I think you'll be interested in this as I wrap up. There's a pattern here of butterflies that mid-20th century had successfully colonized exotic host plants. For example, this large marble, able to lay eggs on various weedy mustards, seemed like a pretty good deal mid-20th century. You get to the end of the 20th century, bad news in severe decline. Not everybody's declining. The Western tiger swallowtail doing really well, rudolus, wherever we find it. So there's things to be learned about the species doing well, and even some things that I think you might not think would be doing well, like pipevine swallowtail, Batis philonor. That's a very specialized animal, right? Doesn't have a ton of hosts in California, doing pretty well. Interesting. We have a lot to learn about who's declining and who's not. And with that, I want to wrap it up, and I'm going to jump straight to my thanks slide. And thank you for listening. It was a pleasure, and I'm happy to take some questions. I skipped over a summary slide there just because I didn't want to talk for a full hour. That's a terrible thing to do. So I'm going to stop right there and take a question if anybody has one.
I've put everybody on mute
Hmm.
who hadn't put themselves on mute. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please, now's the time. You can all take yourselves off mute and ask questions.
And if anybody is more comfortable typing something in a chat, that's cool too. That's fine too. I also know it's late on a Friday night, so I'm not offended if people want to check out. And I, oh, actually, let me share that screen again because I had my, oh, is that still there? Can you still see that
Yeah,
screen?
we still see it.
Okay, great.
We see your beautiful mountain pictures.
Oh, here, wait a minute. I wanted you to be able to see my, my email address. Is it not at the bottom there?
No,
Oh, what did I do?
just the lovely view of the mountains.
Oh, here we go. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. We can do that again. Let me just leave that up there for a minute. If anybody wants to get in touch with me later or would like a copy of a paper, etc., I'm happy to send things.
I do some butterfly counting. I contribute to some of those databases, but I did my own mini analysis of some butterflies that we were doing in one area, and I compared it to a study that was done in 1970, and I noticed a little shift in the broods, and I was wondering if that in the populations of the broods is, and I was thinking I think it was particularly when you were talking about the fall broods being decreasing. I was wondering if the shifting in the broods that I was seeing in terms of volume was because the earlier broods were no longer as much because of that, or I'm not quite sure what I was seeing or why, but I did notice that of the butterflies that we were counting in Orange County.
Yeah, there's a quite a complicated issue there that actually people have worried about a lot with the NABA data in particular, because if you count butterflies at one time in the middle of summer, and if phenology is changing, if the broods are shifting, or if they're coming out earlier in spring and not later in summer, maybe you would sort of think they're declining and maybe they're flying at a different time. We've agonized over this too, and I actually think weirdly, it seems to not only is it not a problem, but there actually might be a bias in the opposite direction. We see that butterflies that emerge earlier as the temperatures are warming actually seem to get to higher densities by midsummer, which is not true across all species, and it's not exactly answering your question, but it's something interesting we've seen. The other thing, to your point though, one of those last species I showed there, the large marble, Euchloiosinides, in our area, it used to have 2 broods. And as it declined, the second brood disappeared before it went all the way to extirpation. And I don't know what the deal is. I don't know if there was like really a change in sort of the dynamics in terms of diapause, or if it was the case that densities were just so low we weren't detecting the second generation. But sort of the overlay of brood dynamics on top of censuses across time is complicated, and we are doing our best with it. But there are some folks that have advocated that it's also complicated. We sort of don't know what's going on. We've decided to push ahead, making our best estimates with the idea that we might be wrong about some of these species someday, but the gestalt pattern of declines is pretty strong. Yeah.
I have a comment. The marginal areas in the agricultural areas sound like, and it has been advocated in crop production, that it's an asset, but based on your comments of the amount of pesticide, it would seem like that would be a target area, that those marginal areas would be higher in pesticides and not necessarily in a reserve.
Yeah, I'm thank you for asking that, because I was trying to hurry there at the end, but you're absolutely right. And one shouldn't naively restore margins and think that it's going to be okay. Obviously, it needs to have the partnership of the neighboring ag fields. Also, your question reminded me that I had promised to come back to sort of a positive message there at the end. the positive message was to explain that sort of mysterious upswing that the Central Valley had during the mega drought years. Those were years that were so hot and dry that those species at low elevations, persisting in that complicated ag matrix, emerged a lot earlier, sometimes a month earlier. And what it seems to have happened is that extra time let them sort of build to higher densities throughout the year, sometimes even adding a generation. And that demographic effect was big enough to temporarily counteract all of the stuff that had been thrown at them, pesticides, over the years. It didn't last. When it went back to sort of normal phenology years, they collapsed again. But that tells me that those populations persisting in those marginal areas have a lot of resiliency built into them. So I think there is potential there, but yeah, acknowledging that it's complicated to restore ag margins without reducing pesticide use for sure.
So here's a question for you. Is there such a thing as a pesticide reserve or pesticide-free preserve? How big an area, or what's the potential for setting up areas that don't get overspray or don't get any leaking of pesticides in?
Yep. So just this summer, we're starting a new project with Fish and Wildlife Service to look at wildlife refuges of different sizes in the northern Sacramento Valley and look at pesticide incursion into those properties. And so we're going to hopefully find that there's some size of refuge that has enough buffer that if you were going to do restorations in that type of property in a refuge, you'd want to target those areas. But we're going to try and figure that kind of thing out. Again, it's weird in that I'm not a toxicologist. I don't know how I ended up looking at this pesticide stuff, but I'm disappointed at how few scientists are out there asking about toxins on the landscape. It's not enough.
Okay.
And if just to follow up on that, wouldn't it be interesting if there were these pesticide preserves where perhaps small farms could be invited and perhaps supported by, I don't know, Fish and Wildlife or whoever in growing pesticide-free crops and enabling these ag margins? That would be, I mean, is that something you see as feasible?
Yeah, and the Xerces Society is working down that path. That was why they had asked us to map those agricultural areas so that they could know whose door to knock on. And one thing that I've learned from them is that you'd think it would be the small farmers who you'd want to get on board with this, and they might want to, but their profit margins are smaller. So Xerces Society has been having success talking to people like General Mills, where their profit margin is large, and they're happy to just like take some land and like, yeah, whatever, you can, make it good for bees and butterflies because we don't care. They've got so much land. So there is some hope. There ironically is some hope with the mega big farming companies in the Central Valley.
I think there is a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, let me look. Oh yeah. Oh, so so are the large and small nurseries buying the milkweed from the same growers? So my colleague at the Xerces Society, who's their pesticide expert, spent months calling these nurseries, asking them where they got their plants, and it was a pretty frustrating dead end. And that there was a lot. There were so many different suppliers that it sort of like almost was the same as the nurseries. In other words, we couldn't find suppliers that were in common, and that didn't actually make sense to me because I'm sure you've had the experience of seeing some brands that across nurseries. But there's still a lot of suppliers at the start of that food chain, and I don't understand the complexity of it. It's quite complicated, and sometimes these plants come from far away and change hand multiple times. How about this, which you may know, but I felt naive when I learned this. Sometimes when you buy a plant especially I guess at the big box stores, they may have started as seedlings in other countries and then been shipped to the US in the hold of a ship. Well, what happens if you put a seedling in the hold of a ship for 3 weeks? It's crappy and dark, so you got to cover it in fungicides before it gets to the shelves where you buy it. It's like, ah, God, why does the world have to be so complicated, right? It's terrible. Which is to say, Xerxes is trying to figure out that supply chain issue. It's beyond me. It's complicated.
So is the real answer just encourage more seeds and more seed crops?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sad, right? I love to go to the store and buy plants too. I think there will be some things to do. It is very possible that things like pulling them out of the dirt, because I think the soil you get from the big box stores has probably been in a loop where it's been reused a lot in that nursery chain, and it may be loaded itself with pesticides that go systemic into plants. That's just a hypothesis. I don't have data for that. But taking it out of the soil, watering it heavily for a few days can't be bad. So a lot of pesticides you can literally wash off of leaves. So when you put something in your garden, just wash it heavily for a couple of days. But yeah, I mean, if you can grow stuff by seed, obviously that's the best. And one could hope someday there might be a niche, especially for smaller nurseries, to sell more stuff to the real dedicated home gardener that's willing to pay a little more for stuff that was grown locally from seed.
Well, this creates an opportunity of maybe I should be contacting the seed producers and telling them to talk to you and get your encouragement, or to get you to
Yeah.
encourage them.
And I actually heard secondhand from someone in Reno, a guy that owns a local nursery, who just had no idea. And he's like, well, we grow a lot of our own plants. It's not that big of a deal. If you want us to not spray them with a couple of things, we can do it. So they just were using it because it's like they're trained to do this, to have perfect plants, right? But if they get the idea that you could put something on the shelf that maybe was not perfect, but you put a label on that says 100% pesticide free, they just don't know. Yeah. So it's worth having a conversation with your local friendly small nursery that might be interested.
I did run into a small a lady that we talked about this in a few meetings ago. This lady that she was growing butterfly plants and selling them from her house. She has a website too. It's called it's a monarchy. And I bought from her a bunch of plants, and everything that I bought from her, they got eaten up so fast because again, they were not toxic. I put it in my side yard, and I guess I picked it up at the wrong time because there were butterflies flying and they cleaned it up.
Well, that is funny, right? Like if we get these plants that are going to be really good for our butterflies, they're going to eat them.
So between the monarchs, and I had milkweed for monarchs, and I had the passion vine for Gulf Fritz. They completely, the passion vine, they destroyed it. So.
Oh my God, those Gulf Frets are voracious, right?
Yeah.
But they're beautiful butterflies to have around.
And one of the things that you said was you were talking about a species that was not declining, it was doing well, the Western swallowtail.
Yeah.
Western swallowtails, don't they feed on trees?
Yeah, and so, you know, cottonwoods and ashes and things.
Unless they're feeding on almond trees, then they're not going to be exposed to pesticides as much.
Yep, and they seem to do okay on those trees in urban settings, but again, like you say, they might be up high above the stuff that's going on in people's gardens. So that could be a good explanation for why they're happy.
Well, have you checked for how many species are arboreal and not ground foraging species?
You know, we have used growth form in terms of woody or not, and I don't remember it being very powerful. I mean, part of the problem is our data encompasses this sort of mega drought where everybody just did really badly. So then we're trying to find signals on top of that. It's challenging.
Another 100 years, you'll have it all figured out.
Right. Yeah.
If anybody has any other questions, you're welcome to email. I guess Mr. Forister would be happy to answer emails. I'll probably annoy him myself.
Yep.
And does anybody else have a last minute question for him?
Yeah, thanks. These have been great questions. I'm impressed. I was skeptical that people would be awake enough at 8 o'clock on Friday night to ask some good questions. So that's great.
Well, we are entomologists. We really appreciate you coming and